Welcome to the Royal Air Force Museum. I'm standing in front of an obscure little aircraft, but it's actually one of the most interesting aircraft in our collection. This is the German Heinkel 162 Volksjäger, the People's Fighter. By late 1944, Germany was being bombed day and night by hundreds of Allied bombers. They wanted to shoot these bombers down, but they needed a new fighter plane for this. Had to be faster than any Allied aircraft. They needed thousands of them, and they needed them right away. So by September 1944, the order went out to different companies. And by January 1945, this was already in production. Now, normally this would take 2 or 3 years. The Germans did this in just 4 months. They were still changing the design while it was already on the production line. An example of that can be seen at the end of these wings. These are winglets, quite similar to what you find on modern airliners. This was done because the wing suffered from vibrations. So instead of completely redesigning the wing, they simply added those winglets to the production line. They were going to produce 1,000 a month. Now obviously they would have to cut some corners. While most combat aircraft were produced mainly out of aluminium, this Heinkel was mainly produced out of steel and wood. Also, the tail fins are made out of wood. There are 2 tail fins instead of 1 in order to prevent the exhaust of the engine igniting the tail. The engine being on top is probably the most striking aspect of the Heinkel 162. Most of the airfields in those days were not concrete runways, they were grass airstrips. If the jet engine were lower, it would suck in all kinds of grass and debris. Plus, the engine being on top made it more easy for maintenance crew to work on the engine. However, if the pilot were to bail out, he would get sucked into the engine. So the Germans installed one of the very first ejector seats. When we look inside the aircraft, very simple. It has the most basic instruments. The most interesting is this glass panel. It will show the pilot if the nose wheel is up or down. Most factories in those days had been bombed out, so the Germans decided to use abandoned caves and tunnels. And to produce these machines, they decided to use slave labor, concentration camp inmates who had to work and sleep in those caves. The dark and damp conditions meant that thousands of them died. Those same conditions also meant that these Heinkels were often badly produced and not fit for service. Quite often, parts of the tail or the wing would rip off during flight. So obviously, this was not exactly a safe plane to fly. But this was not a problem for the Nazi leaders. No, because they were not even going to use real pilots. And this is actually the reason why this is called the People's Fighter. They were going to use Hitlerjugend boys, aged 16, 17, with only minimal glider training. They were told, if you cannot shoot the bombers down, just ram them. Now, just imagine thousands of these fighter aircraft, flown by boys, but flying faster than any aircraft, flying against or even into Allied bombers. It would have been absolute carnage. So in the end, it's a good thing for all sides that these planes arrived too late to see actual service. Strangely enough, after the war, when the most famous British test pilot, Eric Winkle-Brown, flew the Heinkel 162, he actually commented that it was one of the finest aircraft he had ever flown.